Hi, my name is Nick Lindenfeld, and I wanted to tell you all a little bit about one of the most interesting and one of the most controversial topics in American history, known as the Vietnam conflict. The Vietnam conflict was essentially fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam and their allies, and it was fought from 1954 to 1975, almost a 20-year war that began actually had origins directly after World War II. So essentially what happened is after World War II, Ho Chi Minh in the north, the communist leader, essentially squared off versus Bao Dai, a non-communist leader in the south. In 1954, Vietnam is divided here along the 17th parallel, with South Vietnam, North Vietnam up here, and then we have the Gulf of Tonkin that does come in a little bit later. So Ngo Dinh Diem of the South, he ends up coming to power in 1954, and he is very, very staunchly anti-communist. This all according to History.com. Diem begins arresting Viet Cong, which is his term for the Vietnamese communists in the north, and he literally is arresting them by the thousands. At the same time, the United States is in a Cold War versus the Soviets, and to a lesser extent the Chinese. This is essentially fought all over the issue of communism. We don't have a lot of ulterior conflicts going on just yet domestically, but communism is definitely a big one. This, of course, is in the age of Joe McCarthy and the whole Red Scare in general. So in 1955, under the Eisenhower administration, the United States does end up deciding to back South Vietnam. So through all of these presidents, actually, through all their administrations, from Eisenhower all the way through Nixon, we do have this theory that comes about that they have established known as the domino theory. The domino theory essentially suggests that if one country in a given area falls to the communist threat, then all of the countries in the area will be consumed as well. So during Johnson's administration, we do have the Gulf of Tonkin conflict, and we do have the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Essentially, reports come back that say that there was that one of the North Vietnamese boats fired upon a U.S. destroyer, allegedly. And the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, according to a study published by the University of Illinois, comes about when Johnson hears about this, and he decides that he needs to have all the power necessary to fight the communist conflict in Vietnam. So he is granted this by Congress, and this allows him to slowly keep escalating the war. Now, when Nixon comes in, he subscribes to the theory of Vietnamization. He believes that when we are in Vietnam, we can train and educate the South Vietnamese fighters and train them to use United States arms to fight their own fight. So essentially, this is his plan for getting the South Vietnamese armed, ready to fight their own war, and to get the United States out. Now, over the 60s and 70s, we do have Johnson and Nixon slowly but surely escalating the war, continuing to drop many, many bombs, and escalating even into Cambodia and Laos, even though the conflict is essentially just centered in Vietnam. Through months and months of peace negotiations in the early 70s, we do eventually come to a ceasefire in 1973. Shortly thereafter, according to certain reports from PBS.org, the ceasefire is broken. We do get reports coming back from overseas that the North is still encroaching on South Vietnamese territory, and the war is essentially not ending when it said it was supposed to. Now, in 1975, Saigon does fall to the Northern Communists, and we see that the South Vietnamese and United States efforts are all but for nothing, to some extent. The overarching goal that we had was to establish South Vietnamese independence, and we were not able to achieve that or achieve the quote-unquote peace with honor as stated by President Nixon. And then even further after that, we do see the National Institute of Health publishing reports saying that we have health defects based on the chemical warfare that is undertaken by the United States, and this, of course, being chiefly among them being Agent Orange. We do have, you see, birth defects, you do see a lot of facial deformities as a result of that, even decades later. One of the issues that we deal with in learning about this in history is that we are very much taught from the American perspective that we didn't necessarily lose, we didn't necessarily win, and we fought valiantly regardless. We attribute this to somewhat of an American hubris, which is just this overwhelming sense that we're right. It's almost an arrogance. And we are very staunch believers that we did not lose the war, and all the presidents and administrations from that time period would say that we did not lose the war. This is still technically open for debate, but as of 1975, with the fall of Saigon, the United States' aims were not necessarily accomplished, and we retreated and came back home as partial victors, maybe. In any case, we do see this as a very important turning point in domestic and international relations during this time period. We are, of course, seeing a lot of racial tension and violence at home, and then the protests against the Vietnam War that essentially completely brought domestic life into turmoil at the time. As we see it now, nearly 30 years later, over 30 years later, there is still dispute as to whether or not this conflict was necessary, as to whether it was warranted, or whether or not there was a clear winner. But as we can see, history does show us some of the facts, some of the buildup that, we're able to piece together a lot of information about this and allowing people to kind of come to their own conclusions about what actually happened and what the real results were.